For our yearly event, for our yearly event this year, we have asked Ruth Roselle to speak to us. What a jewel she is. She has done many, many things. You know, she is a scholar. And when you say that word, there's just a lot in that word that you may not imagine, just all kinds of study and preparations. To truly carry out the spirit of a scholar is difficult work. And so we appreciate her gifts in a scholarly way. We also know that she's an educator and a woman of faith and a pastor. She has a pastor's heart. She helped found the Lao American Baptist Church in Lenexa. She was the pastor of all kinds of things at Prairie Baptist Church for a number of years, along with others. And she carries a passion for social justice. And currently, she is the director of contextual learning, the director of the Buttrey Center for Peace and Nonviolence, the Diane C. Shoemaker Chair of Peace and Justice. I'm real proud of that part. An associate professor of pastoral theology and counseling. Very, very well trained. But the reason she's here today is because she has a passion for justice, for social justice, to care for and help the poor. And did I mention she has a doctor's degree from Vanderbilt? Hey, Ruth, I understand that you're going to speak to us, and the title of your topic, I'm looking desperately for it. I can't find it here. It's the urgency of the climate crisis, responding as people of faith. Would you please share with us?
Oh, well, that wasn't a good entrance. I thought I was ready to go here. Sorry about that. Yes, I'm so glad to be here with you. Let me just get reset up. I must have done something first. Yeah, I'm talking about the urgency of the climate crisis. And this is a great topic to talk about on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. As you know, King started the Poor People's Campaign as an effort to address the evils of racism, poverty, and militarism. But his assassination occurred in Memphis in support of Black sanitation workers that are protesting hazardous and polluted working conditions. So he understood the interrelatedness of all things and the importance of a healthy environment. And in fact, some people regard him as having paved the way for the environmental justice movement. And so 50 years later, when the Poor People's Campaign was rejuvenated, and many more were recognizing how poor people experience the greatest suffering from environmental injustice and climate change. The Revive Poor People's Campaign, a national call to world revival, had added ecological devastation to what they're trying to address, along with poverty and systemic racism, militarism. So it's a great time for us to talk about this together. I'm so appreciative to Unique Finds for the work they do in justice and uplifting folks that are lower resourced. And so thank you for this opportunity to be together today. So what I'm going to talk about, the urgency of the climate crisis, responding as people of faith. Addressing three questions that come out of the title in a sense. Why is climate change now a crisis with such urgency? Why should people of faith respond? And how can people of faith respond? But before we do that, I want you to just sit back a little bit and envision what can be, okay? We need to use a little bit of imagination and envision a world that can be after we have addressed the climate crisis. Such a world would no longer use fossil fuels. Imagine a world where all of our energy is renewable, solar, wind, maybe hydro, Our electric cars will be quiet, little maintenance, quick uptake, fun to drive. Those walking the streets will smell clean air rather than gas fumes and will enjoy a quiet walk. The lawnmowers will mow the grass quietly. With needed reforestation, animal and bird life will be renewed so that there'll probably be more bird song. The sky will be bluer. There won't be toxic leaks into the oceans and the land and the rivers, so that it all is healthier. And when we start drawing down the carbon from the atmosphere, perhaps the oceans maybe will get a little cooler and the coral will revive. And in the process, we will learn how to reduce our energy use. We will learn how to use sustainable sources, and we will have learned new ways of sustainable and what I also think is spiritual living. So keep your envisioned world in mind, okay? It can give us some hope and energy. It is possible because we know what we need to do and we have the technology to do it. But to get there, we need to face reality and we need to ask the question, why is climate change now a crisis with such urgency? So the situation that we are facing is one that's been in the making for a number of decades. We have been burning fossil fuels since the industrial age, but this has increased dramatically in the last few decades, as you can see from this slide. And I want to give credit to the Climate Reality Project for a number of these slides that are more technological, move around and stuff. Right now, we are spewing out 162 million tons of global warming pollution into the atmosphere, as if it were an endless open sewer every 24 hours. And over time, this has thickened the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere so that more of the energy coming from the sun is trapped inside the atmosphere. So previously there was a balance between the amount of energy coming in and the amount of energy from the sun going out of the atmosphere, just the right amount to keep our planet warm enough to sustain life and the magnificent capacity of life that it has. But now more of that heat is getting trapped inside because those greenhouse gases is providing a thicker shield for them to escape. And the increase of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, others, has created this energy imbalance that is causing the Earth to warm so that now the global rise in temperature is about 1.1 degrees Celsius above a previous level. Now, that doesn't seem to be that much, but when you think of heating the whole Earth and the oceans and everything, that takes a lot of energy. And up to this point, about 93% of that has been absorbed by the oceans. So we may not be experiencing as much of the actual warmth as we would anticipate. And some parts of the Earth are warming faster than other parts. But what we are noticing, and this is increasingly so, we are noticing the effects of global warming through disaster events. So those warmer oceans increase the speed and destructiveness of the hurricanes and increase the amount of precipitation that is released. Those hotter temperatures over land increase evaporation, dry out the land, but then what's evaporated contributes to the deluge of rain that falls and causes flooding in other places. The hotter temperatures cause more lightning strikes on forests that are drier, causing more ferocious wildfires. And of course, all of this affects the ability to raise crops and to have water. It affects the wildlife in the ocean and on land and whether it can survive. It affects health in many different ways. And so we're increasingly seeing these effects and connecting the dots to understand that the greater threat of these natural disasters is related to climate change. And there's more talk about that in the news. Scientists are warning us that there are indications that we're getting into serious trouble. So natural events have been increasing over time. You can see over the years that more of them are happening. Scientists know that temperatures rise as carbon levels in the atmosphere rise, and that level has been around between 180 to 280 during the time that humans have been on Earth. But right now, it is at 415, and you can see the way it's rising. It's going up, and humans have actually not been living at this level in the past. So if temperature rises following carbon rises, you can see where this could be going. We know that of the last 20 years, the last 19 were the hottest on record. And in fact, the hottest have been the last 7. There have been increasing numbers of prolonged heat waves. And in some places, the temperature has gotten so high that it has threatened the capacity for human beings to be living. And there's this fear that we're going to reach tipping points, that are sudden climate changes that cascade into rapid irreversible changes that then release large amounts or sharp increase of greenhouse gases and global warming. So the more we push toward this, the more concerning it becomes. Despite all of the talk that's been going on for a lot of years about nations getting together and talking about this, there's still so much that needs to happen, and greenhouse gases are continuing to rise. The projection is that even if they keep the promises from the Paris and the Glasgow climate summits, that greenhouse gases will continue to rise 14% in the next 9 years. And this will make it highly unlikely that the global temperature rise will be able to be contained to that 1.5 degrees centigrade rise from pre-industrial area levels that we were hoping to attain to maintain the stable climate. In fact, now the projections are, if we continue on, it's more likely to rise to a 2.4 to 2.7 degrees Celsius increase. And if we just don't do anything, we can keep our current path of using carbon and fossil fuels, it will increase by potentially 4.4 degrees centigrade, which is pretty devastating. Even though it sounds like a small number, it will have a very big effect. So this is very concerning. Dr. Robert Davies, who is a professor of physics at Utah State University and works with the Utah Climate Center, helps us see what we're facing in this little graph that he made. Here's his projection of our future, according to the decisions that we make. Immediately doing everything that we could to reduce carbon emissions will lead to a low carbon future. And greenhouse gases will probably level off around at 2 degrees Celsius rise, and then maybe you can see the bottom green there, even dipping down a little bit. But if we continue doing what we're doing and continue releasing carbon emissions at the rate that we are doing currently, that temperature could raise up to 4 degrees Celsius. And you can see again, the curve that it has is going steeper and steeper to higher temperatures. According to the NASA Scientific Visualization Studio, and Dr. Davies has put these together, here is what the difference could be between a low carbon future and a high carbon future in terms of temperature. You can see there's significant temperature rise if we continue on our path by the end of the century. Here's the soil moisture. Things get significantly drier on a high emissions future. So those pictures are rather startling and concerning as we think about it, I think. So what makes this an urgent issue that is, as a world, we must address this immediately. The next 5 to 10 years is absolutely critical for the future. And the sooner, the better, because it'll be less expensive to deal with and less will be lost permanently. So in order to have a livable climate future, scientists are saying we must cut our greenhouse gases by approximately 45%, or roughly half, by the year 2030, and then half again by the year 2040, and then half again by the year 2050, working down toward a zero carbon future. And that means that right now we need to be reducing greenhouse gases by 6 to 7% every single year. And as you saw, we're not really doing that. The Glasgow Summit did accomplish some meaningful things. There are about 100 nations that promised to reduce methane by 30%, which is really good because methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas, although it doesn't last as long as carbon. There were a coalition of nations that promised to reduce, cut in half deforestation by 2030, which is great, included Brazil and Russia. And they started to talk about eliminating fossil fuel subsidies and use. And that's a good thing, because in fact, the fossil fuel industry has been subsidized a lot compared to renewables, 42 times more. And the nations, including the United States, we have a similar kind of graph for this country, are subsidizing fossil fuels, which are driving the climate crisis. It makes absolutely no sense. And yet those companies and those that support them are very powerful. So we are in a crisis. A crisis is an urgent situation that we need to act immediately upon. It means it's a critical time when the decisions that we make a big difference for our future. And it can mean that good decisions also lead to good outcomes. So we are in a climate crisis, and it is urgent that we address it. It's urgent that we as people of faith and faith leaders also address it. Those of you who faith defines who you are. Dr. Davies, along with other scientists, say that we have all the technology that we need, although more is being developed all the time. What we lack is political will. What we need then is a massive people's movement to change political will. And it seems to me that people of faith and faith leaders should be at the forefront of such a movement. So let's move to our second question and talk for a few minutes about why people of faith should respond. There are many reasons for this, but let me state just a few. And I'm speaking from a Christian perspective, but this would have similar themes, I think, from other religious traditions. The Genesis 1 narrative of our origins tells us that God created the earth and all that is in it. And God delighted in it and called it all very good. According to this narrative, humanity was created on the sixth day, along with all the other land creatures, once everything else was in place that we depended on. And the description of humanity's creation in Genesis 2 emphasizes our interconnectedness with the earth. It is from the soil of the ground, and in Hebrew that word is Adamah, that the first human is formed. And in Hebrew, that word is Adam. This little wordplay reminds us that we are made from the elements of the earth. As our bodies are made from soil, they will again become soil in death. Our lives at their most elemental level are intricately interrelated with the land. We are part of this earth. Further, according to, let me go back one. Further, according to the Genesis 1-2 narrative, God's initial instructions to humanity was to cultivate and care for the land. And actually those words can be translated, serve and preserve it. We were created in the image of God to exercise as God's representatives on earth. Under God's sovereignty, humans are to exercise dominion, not dominating, not using and abusing the earth in any way that we desire, but rather as those God has given unique capacity and empowered to carry out God's benevolent reign as overseeing and caring for the earth. So the Hebrew word translated have dominion, rada, must be understood in terms of caregiving, even nurturing, not exploitation, according to Old Testament professor Terence Freetham. And he suggests the word subdue, kabas, means that the earth here, it refers to cultivating or developing the earth till its fullest creative potential. So shaping it to become its very best. This means that people cannot simply use and abuse the earth in any way that they want. Duke Professor Ellen Davis writes, the earth is neither a platform for human activity nor a repository of resources to be mined for our convenience. Far from being inert, the earth is living and responsive to God. It generates life. It puts forth vegetation in response to God's command. So as those whose life has come from the soil and continues to be intricately interrelated with the well-being of the earth, as those made in the image of God, as those designated agents of God's benevolent reign, as those given power and capacity to act on God's behalf, we are to be caretakers and master gardeners of this earth. So its beauty and abundance and balance endure for all future generations. We have been given the special capacity and mandate to do this. So the climate change crisis is not simply a scientific problem or a political problem or national problem or global problem. It is a spiritual problem. The initial instructions we humans received according to our sacred texts, the first commandment God gave was that we are to be God's caretakers and stewards of the earth, preserving this paradise as home for all of God's creatures. These scriptures express God's immense respect for us in making us partners in caring for the well-being of the earth. That seems to be why we were created in large part. That's our special role. And we are needed to step up to that role as never before. Just as God loves us, God loves the earth and everything in it. So John 3:16 says, God so loved the world. And the Greek word for world is cosmos, the cosmos. There are many meanings to that Greek word cosmos, but I would suggest that we consider it as including more than just people, even though that's often how we hear that verse. Surely God loves everything that has been created, and we are to love what God loves. Another reason I think we should treasure and care for nature is that it is often through nature, God's creation, that we most deeply experience God. The heavens are telling the glory of God, writes the psalmist in Psalm 19. Nature isn't simply material and physical. It mediates and is alive with the spiritual. Think of how many times in scripture God is revealed through nature. Moses in a burning bush, to Elijah in the sound of sheer silence, as RSV puts it, after nature's wind and earthquakes. Think about how Jesus often went into nature to be by himself, to discern God's presence and wisdom. Think of yourself and how nature has touched and replenished your spirit and reveals to you the splendor and the wonder and the mystery of God. As we grow to love nature, we join God in loving it, and we want to care for it. The primary message of Jesus is about the kingdom or reign of God. And he taught his disciples to pray, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth." The prophetic writings, especially those of Isaiah, flesh out a picture of this kingdom of God, where life on earth is as it would be if God reigned in its every aspect. War is eliminated and oppression is gone. There's justice and peace between people, and there's harmony with nature. The earth would be flourishing and abundantly providing. People and animals live peaceably together, and every person has enough to experience the goodness and joy of life. It's a compelling, although seemingly elusive future that Jesus calls us to bring into being. But it becomes incredibly more difficult to imagine in a future that faces us without addressing the climate crisis. Most Christians and people of faith, and I know this is very dear to the heart of Unique Finds, we understand that part of faithful living in response to God is helping those who are most in need. The familiar passage of Matthew 25, Jesus identifies himself with those who are most vulnerable, those who are hungry and thirsty and stranger and naked and sick. And what we do for them is what we do for Jesus. People are currently suffering and dying because of the climate crisis, and it is going to be much worse unless significant action is taken. And it is especially the poor and the vulnerable that are and will suffer the most. When weather disasters happen, it is the poorest who don't have the resources to escape, and so they suffer. When crops fail and prices rise, it is the poorest who don't have enough to eat. When there are extreme life-threatening heat waves, it is the poorest or the homeless who don't have ways to cool down. There will be many more climate refugees seeking a home. If we as Christians feel that we should help those most in need, we must address the climate crisis because it is making their problems greater and it is causing even greater need. And the climate crisis is also a justice issue in many ways, not only within our own country, do the poorest suffer the most, but throughout the whole globe and in the gross inequity between the nations, as the Glasgow COP26 summit highlighted this past year. Developing nations who have emitted very little, the least amount of greenhouse gases, are feeling the effects and suffering the most right now and having the fewest resources to address the problems. Wealthier nations are not suffering as much, have more resources to cope, and they have emitted far more. And over the course of the history, the United States has been the greatest emitter. Of course, finally, as people of faith, we should be concerned for future generations and the existence of humanity in this existential crisis. If we don't respond appropriately, Earth's conditions could be far more unhospitable for life by 2100, when many people who are alive, many of our grandchildren, will still be living. Finally, congregations, faith leaders, congregational people, we've been concerned and we've mourned the loss of younger generation in our churches. And there's probably many reasons for that. But what we do know is that the climate crisis is an issue that is of great concern for many generally, but especially for younger people. In a recent study of 16 to 25-year-olds in 10 countries, nearly 60% said that they were very or extremely worried about climate change. 77% said that they considered the future to be frightening, and 56% agreed that humanity was doomed. In a 2021 Pew Research report, they found that 76% of Gen X respondents said that the climate change was their biggest social concern, and 37% said it was their number one. But if churches are not even talking about this or doing anything or in everything to address it, how likely are younger people to think that they have any relevance for them or that they're important for the well-being of the world? So we've talked about indications of this climate crisis and how we are called for many reasons, but also because of our faith to respond. So how can people of faith and people generally respond? Well, I think first of all, we need to become educated about the climate crisis and the solutions that we have to deal with it. We're not going to put the time and energy into responding to it if we don't face the reality of what is occurring. And there's a lot of good reasons we don't want to face this reality because it's pretty frightening. It can make us feel powerless. You may be feeling some of that right now, just looking at all this information that I've presented. It's easier not to want to think about it. Understanding the threat of the climate crisis, however, also holds for us the possibility of being energized for action and understanding how the dots connect between the climate, the global warming and the various weather events that we're experiencing gives us confidence to talk about it. At the same time, we need to educate ourselves about the solutions. We probably all know some, but there are many things we can be doing and need to do that will contribute to the health of our planet. So I know for myself that what enabled me to jump in and get engaged with this issue is understanding not only the dire need, the climate crisis and the global warming, but also the drawdown solutions, the solutions that are already scientifically determined will make a difference. This knowledge of the solutions gave me hope and positive energy and also guidance about what needs to be done. And it helps to spark a vision of what a good future can possibly hold. It's also good, as we're reading the news, to take note of the progress, the good things that are happening so that we can nurture our hope. So drawdown, here I just have put up a couple slides. Here are what they would rank as the top 10 things that would do the most, just the kind of refrigerant we use, and then it talks about different sources of energy, reduce food waste, goes into landfills, causes methane when it's released, plant-rich diet. There's a number of things that, in fact, there's a whole bunch. They have found like 80 different solutions that they've been researching, and they keep researching more of things that can be done to help with reducing the greenhouse gases. So there's a lot of information out there to read, and they've just written another book about this, but understanding the solutions is really important for gaining hope and having confidence in talking about this. I think it's also helpful to work with others, to be in the midst of a community of others who are similarly concerned and working on climate action. There's things we can do individually, and that's important, but this is a very big problem and requires much more than we can accomplish alone. So being in a community can give us support and encouragement to do what we can do, and it can help us build friendships and enjoy the life that we have. So we know a lot about the solutions and have a lot of the technology that's needed. What's lacking is political will. And much needs to be done, needs to be legislated, budgeted, and regulated by our leaders at all the different levels of government. The fossil fuel companies and big businesses do need to be taken on. What is needed is an engaged citizenry and the development of a mass of people's movement to affect the culture and strengthen the political will of leaders to boldly address the climate crisis. And after all we have said, should not we, as people who are concerned and people of faith, be at the forefront of this? So I encourage you to join a community or coalition of concerned people working on climate action at whatever level you feel drawn to address. Deep changes are needed in our country, and there's a lot of groups that are available to work on this. For example, the Citizens Climate Lobby has been focused for years on a national carbon fee on carbon at the source where it's being first used. And then that fee would increase over the years, and the money collected would be returned to people as a dividend so that they could cope with a little bit of rising costs in things that are made with carbon or the transition to renewable energy. So this could really affect a great deal, actually, in terms of carbon emissions if the government decided to put this into action. But there's other groups. There's 350.org, and John can say more about this maybe a little bit later, who's doing a lot to take on the finance, those that are financing fossil fuel development, as well as many other areas. There's quite a few faith groups that are working. Blessed Tomorrow includes a lot of our denominational groups. Each denomination has some group, or many denominations do, you could join. There's Interfaith Power and Light. C3, Christians Caring for Creation, is a new group that has started. Green Faith is an international interfaith group that is doing things. I mentioned the Poor People's Campaign also has ecological devastation as part of their goals. So there's a lot of different opportunities, as well as more local groups that you can be a part of. We can't do everything, but maybe we can do something. And if we do it with others, it works out that we actually do something, and we feel that community support, and it's a joyful thing to be working with others. So become part of a coalition or the mass movement to help to reshape the political will for climate action and become an active citizen. Of course, our democracy is under a little bit of threat at this point. So working also for preserving the vote and being an active citizen is important. And we can work with others for changes at all these different levels. This particular picture is of Kansas City, and the group there, the Climate Action KC, which has developed a whole plan for the KC metro area, coming out of a couple of our local leaders who really worked with the drawdown solutions. And now they've actually, Mayor Kelly, I think, went to Glasgow to talk about how mayors can be helpful. So there are things going on that you can be a part of. We also need to talk with others so that we can affect our sphere of influence, to understand the issue better and get more engaged. So it might be your workplace or social groups or community neighborhood groups, family, friendship networks, educational institutions, congregations. Now I realize this can be tricky and it needs to be done sensitively. Talking about climate change raises people's eco-anxiety and angst and can make them shut down to defend their own sense of feeling, keep them from feeling anxious. So we need to do it sensitively, and it also can get us kind of in the middle of our political polarization, right? So this is a tricky area, and yet it's important. So here's some suggestions. It's important to listen, to ask questions so we understand the other people's perspectives and what they're concerned about. More people are increasingly concerned, but we need to discover what each person we talk to thinks about it and how we can build on that concern. I added here the results of some research being done by the Center for Climate Change Communication. And over the last 5 years, there is, if you look on the right on that kind of the graph from between 2017 to 2021, it's a little small, but it shows that the number of alarmed and concerned people is definitely increasing. If you go to the website where this is, this research, the September 2021 research has shown, it has a bouncing ball showing where people are going, and the alarmed is really going up since about 2018, which I realize is about the time when I got really more engaged too, as we were understanding things better and talking about them more. So you can see now, if you look over on the left, that a third of, this is Americans, a third of people are alarmed. Alarm means they're very concerned and they're wanting to take action. And 25% of people are concerned. That's 61% of people. Nope, 58%. people, sorry, and then there's cautious folks. But look at how small. The dismissive is slightly going down, the doubtful is slightly going, they're very small compared to the number who are alarmed and concerned. So I would suggest, I mean, there is a societal shift within the last few years of people that are more concerned and alarmed. And we need to just maybe work on moving people one over, rather than take on the dismissive first off and try to convince them. How about if we help the alarmed move into action? Because actually that feels more hopeful. How about if we help the concerned become a little more alarmed, I guess, but at least move them into action? So we just helping people move one over is a much more hopeful approach than to take on the most resistant climate denying people. And we do that simply by talking and seeing what's important to them, and then emphasizing the things that they're concerned about. Renewable energy will be healthier. It's going to provide more jobs. It's going to be less expensive, as well as addressing climate change. Maybe it is telling our own climate story. I know when we had a conference at Central, Bob got up and told his story, didn't you, Bob? Climate story. And he held up on his phone a picture of his brand new born grandbaby, was like a day old. Our climate story can have effect when we're talking with people. But we also need to help them move, not to just, we don't want just people to stay alarmed, but to move them into action to see what that they can do. Congregations also, we need to take seriously our influence and responsibility. Leaders at all different levels in congregations, there's a lot of biblical theological themes we can be addressing in our teaching and preaching. People need to understand this imperative that we've talked about today to care for creation, and helping people nurture their love for nature and worship and through activities. We love nature, we want to take care of it, helping them understand solutions. There's a lot of teaching that can go on, and helping people to see that addressing the climate crisis is an important part of the church's mission. It's part of caring for our children and the children of our neighborhood and world. It's part of expressing our concern for refugees and undocumented migrants and the poor. It's part of concern for all of these traditional concerns we have as congregations for people who are in need. And then congregations can work together to decrease the carbon emissions of their congregations and their families. And as we work together to do that, and there's lots of things we can do, you know, from changing to LED light bulbs to electrifying our appliances and our air conditioning and our heating, and putting on solar panels and putting up charging stations. There's all sorts of small and big composting, recycling, small and big things we can do. And as we work together, it kind of educates people about them, and we can encourage them to do the same in their homes. So we can increase this movement. We drove past this church when we were up in Minneapolis one day, and we had kids, our adult kids with us. They said, "Mom, there's a church with solar panels on it." It was right along the highway, Interstate I-35. So we we looked at it. We looked it up on the internet. There it was. You know, they have a community garden. They have all sorts of stuff. It was like that attracted me to this church. And if I lived in Minneapolis, I'd check it out. And then we can do personal responses, right? There's a lot of things we can do, and we can start to do them ourselves, or we can do them ourselves and then invite others to do that. And as we aim for net zero carbon living, we are working to live the hopeful future now. It also gives integrity to our actions and demonstrates the possibilities of living a different kind of way. So transportation, you know, if you've got good renewable energy source in your mix of electricity, then getting an electric vehicle the next time you get a car, using cars less. If you're in an area that has transit, use that. Biking, walking, avoiding air travel. Energy, consider if it's possible to get solar panels, to electrify things in your home, so that every new building should all be electric, but we can be replacing as we do that, paying attention to our energy sources, companies, and encouraging them to increase their renewables, energy efficiency, in our buying, to decrease those things that use fossil fuels like plastics, fast fashion, the plastic clothes, it uses up a lot of fossil fuels, decrease beef, and work for more of a plant-based diet. So there's less deforestation and methane release, composting, all of these things. There's lots that we can do individually or as families. But finally, I want to end just by saying we need to care for ourselves. I encourage you, this is a difficult issue to think about if you really think about it. It's really hard. So care for yourself. Don't think about it all the time. Treasure and savor the goodness of life and of nature and of being with those you love. Be compassionate for the grief that you may already be experiencing of what we are losing and have already lost. Focus on a few things you can focus on and change and work for. Look for signs of hope. And there are many. That good is being accomplished and we are moving forward. And of course, we do place our ultimate hope in God. And I have to say these, flowers, and this little guy is our grandson. I couldn't resist putting him up there because actually he not only provides a lot of motivation, but a lot of joy and a savoring of life right now, which we all need, even though we're engaged in this issue. So I'm going to stop right there. And there's a few minutes, I believe, for questions and for comments that you might have. And
thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Ruth. I appreciate so much the hope that you bring to the whole thing, especially as I see so many are alarmed. A third are alarmed. And really the answer to that is there is hope. Now let's do something. That's so healthy. So this is a time to just ask Ruth questions. I'm sure there are things that have come to you that you might express and help all of us. So I'd take questions at this point, and Ruth, good luck.
And I want to say, though, that we have some other experts here. John Kerman has been involved in this movement a long time, and so has Jerry Rees, and perhaps there are many others as well. So others can also join in here.
Don't be shy. Open your mic and let's ask her some questions.
All right, I'm going to ask you a question then, okay? What do you need in order to move forward in taking action to address the climate crisis?
So I have a question, guys.
Hello.
This is Deborah, my wife. You guys don't know her. Bob and Diane, they know her. So my question is, we are Brazilians and we are from a country where the majority of people, they love eating meat. That's part of our culture. And we are not vegans, we are vegetarians. And we see that as a really important thing to support the climate change and the environment. And how important is that topic for you to fight the climate change?
Yeah, so for me personally, I'm vegetarian as well. I really became that early on more as a peace issue many years ago, but then found out it really does affect the environment. And especially in Brazil, there's been a lot of deforestation of the Amazon in order to grow beef. And of course, the methane that's released, it's real. A lot of our agricultural land is going into raising beef. So as you notice on that kind of graph, plant-based diet was a pretty big chunk. It could make a big impact if people moved for that. What I think is helpful for us to do is, of course, we have to understand cultural desires, right? You have to work within each cultural context, but we increasingly move toward plant-based. So it probably, people aren't, the idea of moving boom to vegan, is a pretty big jump. But to talk about the effects, I think traditionally, I grew up in East Africa, and traditionally, before refrigeration, people would have a feast of meat, but they didn't do it every single day and every single meal. you know. So to be, it could still be a part of people's diets if that's really an important part to them, but to really explore and talk about the goodness of eating plant-based diets. And that's kind of where I just love a peaceful form of eating, to be honest with you, and enjoy all of the variety of vegetables and beans. And actually, I just read yesterday, the 4 blue zone areas where people live the longest, they eat a lot of beans, you know, so there's lots of good benefits. So if we talk about not the restriction and giving up so much, although there is, you know, too much meat itself isn't that great, but more try to model it and encourage expanded plant-based. But I do think it is an important aspect of what we need to be moving toward. But the literature keeps going saying plant-based rather than saying vegetarian, you know,
Yes,
so it's not trying to be legalistic about this. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. John, do you want to say anything about what 350.org is doing?
If I can remember how to unmute. Well, I didn't come exactly to prepare. I come prepared to actually to say anything, but since you've invited me, I'll just say a little bit. 350.org is the international grassroots climate action movement founded by Bill McKibben and 7 of his graduate students, and I think it was 2007. The idea being that it wasn't going to be enough to do what organizations had been doing prior, which is basically lobbying the government to pass legislation and implement regulations, that if we were going to take the necessary actions to deal with climate change in the short window of time that we have, we would need a mass movement. We would need people protesting, rallying, being out in the streets, and really pushing for change, because ultimately it's that kind of movement, only that kind of movement that can move the needle on justice. You know, Dr. Martin Luther King is known, I'm sure I won't get the quote exactly right, for saying the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice, which he actually was paraphrasing a Unitarian minister whose name I'm blanking on right now from the 1800s. But the thing about that quote, as Dr. King would surely have said, is that if you read it just like that, it seems like the moral arc bends on its own, that it's something that just magically happens. But that's not the reality of the situation. When the moral arc of the universe bends, it bends because enough of us take it in our hands and struggle mightily together to bend it. And that's what we need to be doing on all the issues we care about, of course. But the thing about the climate crisis is if we don't get this right, it will literally wreck everything else we accomplish, because it goes to the heart, the basic life support system of the planet. And I've spoken enough, I'll stop.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ruth. And what John has just said about the things that you have mentioned, the spiritual crisis, that speaks to me a lot. When I see a tree cut down to build a big houses, when I see trash in our creeks, in our river, when I see a homeless sleeping under the bridge on a cold day like yesterday, we see them every time we pass through, because John and I live in Midtown. My heart just breaks, and that is a spiritual crisis that is going on. And so, for those of us who don't have the power to move government, let's not be scared. But what Dr. Ruth has mentioned, that we have in our circle, how small it is. We have friends, we have family that we can talk to, and it all needs to start from a loving heart. And Dr. Ruth has mentioned that all these problems, if we read in the news, the refugee that is happening in Syria, in South America, and in India, in Bangladesh, and that is huge. But there is a Spanish poet that I really like, Antonio Machado is his name, and he wrote in Spanish that is translate, traveler. For travel, there is no path. The path is made by walking. And so as we take a small step by engaging with our friends, with our families, I do think that there is hope and our spiritual crisis can be healed. And we need to talk about this. And so thank you so much for doing this, Dr. Roth, and for all the good research that you have mentioned, and for the love that you have for us and for the church and for our community.
I'd like to add my thanks too. I appreciate your emphasis on impacting the poor more. And that I think one of the ways we can wake up to this is when we see, oh, there's a lot more refugee resettlement, because like a famine creates a whole nation has to move, and that if this gets bad enough, we're the ones that are going to have to move, I mean, it gets very personal, and we can kind of begin to see we got to start doing something, and so you're on Martin Luther King Day for us to realize that this impacts the poor and we care about the poor, and that if we don't watch out, that's going to be us too, I mean, that gets much more awakening, rather than just be alarmed. I would hope we would take the actions that get us there. We are at our time limit. Theoretically, at least we thought we'd be about an hour, and we'd like to respect that. Ruth, thank you so much, not only for sharing with us today your wisdom, but living it out all year round in all the ways you do. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And to all of you who took the time and care enough to listen to Ruth, thank you for coming. Thank you for your support of Unique Finds. We love you. We thank you for the love you bring to us. And may we be part of a community that makes a difference in how we shop and how we work and how we love. Thank you, God, for all of you today. God bless you.
And this will be available, the recording will be available, okay?
So that you can share it with others.
So that you can share with others. All right.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Let's go out and take some action.
Take care, guys.
Bye.
Thanks for having me.
Nice.
Thank you, Dr. Roth.
You're welcome.
Yes.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yes.
Thanks to all of you for coming.
You.